Just want to say, Mr. Collmore is here in attendance and Mrs. Williams.
Yeah, and I'll just provide a quick introduction to what you're going to see tonight. So, we, pulled November's numbers. So, part of what we wanted to share with the finance subcommittee today is where we're at through the month of November. In the budget categories that you're accustomed to seeing during the budget development process, and then give a real quick high level overview of the budget process that we're about to kick off, like a timeline and just a high level overview. Then I would hope to close with just letting you all know that Mickey and I are very much interested in what priorities you have so that we can consider them as budget development process. Um, so happy, feel free to share towards the end of the meeting what your priorities are, and we'll also follow up with an email just to formally request what your priorities are for the budget development process um, after. Thank
Can
you.
I share that in the future there should be additional copies of the presentation for those members of the school committee who may attend the meeting so that they have access to the information in a readable fashion?
You did. It was shared at the last school committee meeting, and it was referred to finance, so it was part of your packet. It was part of your last month's packet. This was on the agenda, and then it got referred to finance. So the entire presentation was a part of last month's packet, which is what we're going to be going over today. And I have with me today Mickey, our Chief Financial Officer.
All right. Well, it's great to be able to meet with you again. Do you need? I see the copy that you've got there is the tiny version print of the slides. Okay. All right. And you have one on. You have it. Great. Great. All right. Well, so if we can go back to the first slide, I'm not sure if Mike or Sam are controlling it. So this is today, but we sent this in December on the 19th, and so we're going to talk about a snapshot of the current year that we're in the middle of and what our spending is like. Then we're going to give an initial look at next year's budget and a little bit about the timeline for that budget development process. Okay, so we can go to the current year, and so what we want to do is give this every month, but however often you really like it, a monthly snapshot of where we're at that point in the year. So the next slide, this is one way to cut it. So we're going to show you two different ways that we group our spending. This is by more or less department or chief, and the spending that are under the control of one chief or another. So it's part of their budget that they're the lead decision maker on. And so you can see here that this is the way Anthony has organized the cabinet and the budget departments. The first column is what was budgeted total for that department. So like for the finance, it was just over $1 million, whereas for pupil services, special ed, it was $13 million. And then the great majority of the money, of course, is in the schools, $69 million. We have in the report what the total spending is just for that month. So this is the spending that just happened in November. And then the year to date, as of the end of the month, this shows how much was spent or committed. So we've said, okay, even if the money hasn't gone out the door, we've what we call encumbered it because it's to pay for something that we have already committed to. And then you see the available budget in the last column, the percent of the budget that has been spent. All right. Questions on this, or I can show you the other way we look at it, and then we can do questions. Either way. Absolutely.
So I'm just trying, so I'm looking here and I look at some of our percentage spent at the end of November is over 50%. And so I'm trying to understand, is that typical where we have been in the past that for finance we're at 58%, operations technology we're at 76% of the budget already being spent. Was it expected to be front heavy for the higher percentage areas?
So those are a great question. And so let's look at that operations technology line, and then we're going to compare it to the schools line, and you're going to see why that percentage is so different. So the operations and technology line is heavily buying stuff, equipment. We're contracting with providers who are providing technical support. Operations is paying for the expenses of keeping our schools up, so a lot of contracted work with that. That $7.2 million is a big chunk of money. The reason it shows as spent is that it is spent and committed. Because we know we are going to spend the money in those areas, we will encumber it, and so it's natural that departments that have the majority of their work is not personnel, is not salary, are going to have a much higher percentage encumbered early in the year. Whereas the schools, the reason that's so much lower is because the great majority of those funds are salary, and that money goes out. We don't encumber the salary. The salary goes out as each payroll goes.
Mm-hmm.
That and it's taking a snapshot from July 1st through November.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about it, not a lot of payroll has hit since between September and November. The teachers don't start getting paid on July 1st. They start
Right.
September last month.
So of the 26 pay periods in the fiscal year that teachers would be getting paid for, not many of them have hit yet. So that's why the salary-heavy items are lower.
Then can you explain also then the pupil services? We're at 67% for special education. And as you just mentioned, we're only technically, 3 months into the year and we've already, spent 67%.
Yeah. So there's
Or committed.
3 big types of spending in the pupil services budget. One is for personnel. So we pay for a set of staff through the pupil services budget, such as psychologists, speech and language technicians, occupational and physical therapists. And then we also pay for a category for paraprofessionals that are providing direct one-to-one support that is IEP-based paras. So there is a staffing element as part of the pupil services budget.
Is it only one-on-one paras that are also shared paraprofessionals in the model?
Shared
special
paras
ed.
are also budgeted through this section, through this budget, rather than the school's budget. The other paraprofessionals, so if the paraprofessional
Like
position
kindergarten.
is dictated by an IEP, we budget for that through pupil services. If it is not, we budget for it at the individual school level. Now, that salary component of pupil services, while not small, because it's a $13 million budget, it is not the biggest segment of the budget. The biggest segment of the budget for pupil services is out-of-district tuition, and that we will encumber. So that's a contracted service where we're contracting with each of the different schools that provide education for our students, and so we encumber that money. So that would look to be spent, but it's committed, not spent yet. The third category is another set of contracted services where we're contracting for a very wide range of services through special education needs. This year has increased, and you're shaking your head. You know why? Because we haven't been able to hire staff in certain areas. We have increased our contracted services with psychology, with speech and language, translation, and those areas. So that 67% is probably higher than it would be in a typical year by the end of November because of that increased need to contract out for stuff that we would have had staffing for.
And so for translation, we're speaking about translation during meetings as well as translating documents to families?
Correct. That's correct. You have interpretation and translation both.
Okay.
Yep. Great questions. Other questions while we're on this slide? All right. We're going to go to the next slide, and it's the same dollars sliced in a different way that we call this the budget blueprint. So as we develop the budget, the initial at the start of the year, which we're currently doing when we talk about the next year budget, we'll talk a little bit about that. We break out the spending in categories based on type. And so what you're going to see in the top section of this are two lines that we call our discretionary spending. Salaries and all supplies and services. So what stuff after the non-discretionary, the stuff that we have to pay, it sort of comes off the top, do we have left to distribute into salaries and supplies and services for our schools and our departments? The section below that starts with health and life insurance and runs through out-of-district tuition is what we call the non-discretionary expenses. So these things are going to happen, and we take these out of the overall budget development so that we then know how much we can devote to salaries and supplies and services. So the two that are in red, we show in here because they are our expenses, and they're part of our net school spending expenses, but they don't appear in the school district budget. They actually appear in the city budget, and we work with them to develop what's our portion of the two in red. You see there, so health and life insurance and the retirement for non-teachers. So that's a big chunk of money, $10 million. But it's budgeted through the city, and so we show it in here, but we don't track the spending in that same level of degree. Okay, question, Mr. Collins.
Transportation, is that on a city budget or is that on this budget?
It's in this budget, but it's above the net school spending requirement. So the state has a number that you have to meet. That's part of your what's called foundation budget, net school spending. So the state says, hey, your budget needs to be, $92 million. We're going to give you 82. The city only has to kick in 10, but you can't touch that for transportation. The city has to pay in addition to that. They have to provide the funding for transportation. It's that, adult education, and then any leases that are greater than 3 years old. The state says, go for it. You want to spend that, but it's not going to count towards your minimum requirement.
Okay, just one thing I wanted to bring up. Under Chapter 30B12, if it's over a contract over 3 years, this will be over 3 years because it's a combined contract?
That's a great question, Mr. Collmore. Yeah, go ahead. You want to answer?
Anything over 3 years, the law requires you to get, or strongly recommends that the local governing body of that municipality approve up to 5 years. So there's two contracts that we have that we've done that because we strongly believe that it helps the city. One is the food service contract. When you run a $8 million food service operation, you're thinking of bringing your services to Holyoke. You got to get a warehouse. You got to hire employees. You got to do training. That's a large investment to make, and it's more attractive for companies to be competitive if they know they're going to be into that contract for 5 years versus 3 years. Transportation is the same thing. When you hire a transportation company to come run the operations for your district, they have to lease space. They have to go out and lease a bunch of vehicles. They have to find drivers. And it's not attractive for them if they're going to be here for 3 years and then possibly not be here anymore. So we advocated to the city council that we wanted them to approve a 5-year contract so that we can get better pricing and more competition.
What is this board have to vote to?
No, it's the city council.
Not for our transportation is forwarded to city council.
Our whole budget is essentially like they approve the budget just like they approve it for police and everything. They can't, they have to fund the minimum requirement at least. They go through a process of approving the whole city's budget, not just the school department, the whole city's budget, which includes the school department.
Ms. Williams has a question. Yeah.
The insurance, does that cover children that have accidents in school? And how much money is in that insurance budget?
It's a great question. So these lines for insurance do not cover that. There are other types of insurance that the city has policies for that we pay a portion of. We do it through a different mechanism in our budgeting with the city, though.
Thank you.
The city doesn't have a general liability.
They have to have their own.
So what they do have is building insurance. So, like, if a tornado were to come and, like, take out one of our structures, that's covered by insurance. We separately pay an educator's liability insurance that covers all of our staff. But, and then we have workers' comp insurance and stuff like
Okay.
that. But city does not currently, they're self-insured. They don't have general liability. To your point, if something were to happen, the city doesn't have an insurance policy.
So you have to have your own insurance, medical, really, outside.
Right. Or, yeah, if something happens and litigation brought to the city, they don't have insurance that they would have to represent.
But yeah.
Would
Okay,
have to come out of their budget.
thank you. That's
Yeah.
you.
So I have a question concerning unemployment benefits that were already at 100%. That was of the allocated.
So that is encumbered only. So you see the month to date total of 13,000, something roughly around that for the previous month of October and the previous month of September. And prior, we may have something in that range of this times 4 as the total spent. We encumber that so it does not look as if it's available. Now, later in the year, as our employment actual expenses come through, we will sometimes say, okay, look, we're gonna liquidate, or we're gonna change the amount that's encumbered for unemployment because we think there's going to be an extra $100,000 left because the claims are less than we projected. And that line is an interesting one because traditionally the district has budgeted $600,000 in unemployment, but last year, as Anthony and I analyzed it, the costs were coming in much, much lower. And so we reduced the budget for this current year, cut it in half, from 600 to 300,000. Now that actual line is combining this expended plus encumbered, and I think we could certainly just show both columns. One column for how much has been spent year to date, and one column that has how much has been expended year to date.
That would be helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a question of how much detail. You definitely, that's easy to do. That's right. So, yeah.
Well, but if you can't, we're short positions, but we don't want. There's a natural designed from the standpoint of not everyone you hire is going to be a good educator or a good fit for our city. And so there, even if we're short, we're better off being short and having the right people than being short and having wrong people.
Yeah, so I mean, you would think, in some ways, like with the labor market being so difficult, you couldn't hire anybody. Just like, well, you shouldn't have any unemployment claims. Well, that's not actually the case. They went way down, but they still exist at a lower level.
Could be staff that we non-renewed last year and they still haven't gotten a job with another district. Yeah.
We work with an entity that helps us manage the unemployment claims and looks through them to to work on the validity of those claims. And yeah.
So is the cost of that entity included in unemployment, or is it?
Yes.
So that's so broken underneath that is not just what the district is being charged for unemployment fees. It's also the cost of the company that we're using to help us manage those
service
fees.
with, and that's a shared cost between us and the city.
Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah, that helps me understand a little more.
Great question. Other questions about this slice of the current year spending? We're going to see this chart a little bit later in more detail when we talk about the budget for next year. So one thing I'll just point out, and we know this, is that the salaries are the driving force behind the school district budget. It's like that for every school district. We are a people institution, and so it's our people that we invest most of the money in. And so that 39% at the very bottom of that's because salaries is the driving force, and so that's the big number that we are tracking all the time. Is how is our salary spending comparing to what we have budgeted?
Do you know how many students we have out of district that's driving this almost $5 million?
Yes, and I will also tell you that
And that can be done offline, unless anyone else.
I mean, I can tell you it's about 110 students right now, but that $4.4 million or $4.8 million budgeted accounts for less than half of the total. So out of district tuition is close to $10 million total. We pay for it with several different funding sources. This line is only the funding that is part of the general fund budget. So that's the money that the state sets. You must spend this amount, the required spending that the state sets every year, with the great majority coming from the state, some coming from the city, and we have to manage the general fund as its own entity. So this is only the general fund. We also pay for it with two different grant funds, IDEA, which is the federal special ed law, and then there's a special fund that the state has called Circuit Breaker, which is expressly to help districts pay for the costs of individual students' services requiring a much higher than normal expense. And all of the students who are in an out-of-district placement qualify for that circuit breaker. And so we get somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 to $2.5 million of circuit breaker funds every year as well.
All the raises, they're not given at the same time, are they? You have money in the budget, say every 2 years or 3 years, there's a raise. I don't know, but I'm sure we have to go by the law.
So I think there's a couple layers to that answer. It's a great question. The raises for all staff categories, we build that into our budget calculations when we budget for salaries. Now we have to build the budget before each employee group has finished negotiations with the district. So we estimate that. Anthony and Beth Gage and I estimate that, and we build our budget around those estimates. And then as those individual bargaining groups settle their contract, we have a more specific number of what is committed in salary.
I'll just add that, like, to answer, raises our process for everyone on at the same time.
That's the question.
And it's a question of how much each year. They all get it.
Unless there is open collective bargaining agreement that hasn't been ratified, which would happen every 3 years, right?
Oh,
So, like, if we're in the middle of negotiations and by the time the school year rolls around, haven't ratified the compensation with the union, we haven't signed the agreement, we would go ahead and process raises for everyone else until that's done. But that hasn't happened it probably happened once in the 7 years that I've been here, where we couldn't get to an agreement with a particular group, and we processed raises for everybody else until we were able to get to an agreement. But then it's retroactive.
okay, great. Thank you.
Excellent
Follow up
questions.
on that real
Yes.
raises, so that is both cost of living plus step raise
So
or raise.
our contract is structured a little differently than a traditional district's contract, but all of the increases for teachers and for other groups are included in that. Yeah.
It's not a separate cost of living
Okay.
adjustment. So some of our contracts have a normal advancement in the career ladder.
Yeah.
Not a separate. Do have in our new compensation model, which we've given a 10% increase on average to that group, to the teachers group. We do have critical needs stipends for the first time. So if there is a particular type of teacher that's in critical shortage, critical need, they get additional compensation in addition to the step that they're at in the career ladder. And we also every year identify critical needs buildings, typically buildings that have a high level of turnover, a high percentage of economic disadvantaged students, different, and there's additional compensation given to those staff that are in that. I've seen in some groups where they have their normal increase plus once we're done with the evaluation, there's based on their performance they get an increase.
Yeah.
But that's not across the board. It depends what group you're in.
How many contracts not finalized?
I sent you a schedule at the beginning of the school year. We could send that over again. I don't want to misspeak on in public, but I do have. Matter of fact, if you give me 2 minutes, I could look it up, and you guys could keep going.
Other questions about this current year budget snapshot? All right. Well, we can go on, Sam or Mike, to the next year. So we're going to just show you a very preliminary estimate of what we might expect for this coming year. And the starting point, go to the next slide, is really this graph, which I think we looked at last spring, but it really shows the fundamentally different situation the district is in than it has been in for many years. So this graph shows from 2013 through 2019 a virtually flat revenue curve. The problem with that is costs went up every year. So if costs went up by 3% every year, but your revenue only goes up by 0.7% every year, that means you're cutting every year. And up until very recent times, that was the experience of school districts, was that you were cutting every year. So I was a principal for over 20 years, and virtually every single year, that was the budget routine. Okay, how much are you going to cut to maintain the exact, just to maintain what you we're going to do, and you're going to cut from there. So those years were tough, really tough for the district to create strong budgets. Now, you'll see that from 21 to 25 is when the new state law, the Student Opportunity Act, is being implemented. It's going to be implemented beyond 25 too. And that provides increases in the foundation rates that generate how much money each school district has to spend for certain categories. All of the categories that the state was hoping to correct in this new law were ones that we have a lot of in Holyoke. So this law was to help better fund school districts served a high degree of poverty, of students in poverty. So this increase, this what we're projecting is an average of 5% increase, is unprecedented in recent history for the district, and it changes what we can do. So if we go, so basically before this time, every time we would start, Anthony, when Steve Reich was here, he'd say, okay, look, here's your budget, and here's the cut list of, like, we got to figure out how Anthony would determine this is how much money we have to cut from the budget in order to balance it with the revenue that we got. So now things have been a little bit different. We're able to create a budget that is able to, we're aiming to fund as many of the things that we want to do as possible, right? And it's the first time in a long time that we've been able to think that way. Question, Ms. Williams?
How do you determine the poverty level?
It's an excellent question. So the state has measures that they use for that, and it has changed in recent years. But it's common across the state, and so the state tells us our rate for that.
Like a federal threshold of
Yeah, I mean, it was back. When we were going to school, our parents would fill out a free and reduced lunch form, and it would submit all kinds of income, and those free and reduced lunch forms were what was used to generate the percentage of students in need for each school in each district. Now, because of the sophistication of state systems and federal systems, they do a matching. So any student whose family qualifies for Mass Health is flagged as saying, yep, that student qualifies in our calculations as high income, as low income. Any student whose family receives cash benefits through the state is flagged as qualifying. And there's several other typical supports that people receive through state funding that automatically flags them into that category. So those free and reduced lunch forms are really a thing of the past throughout the state.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Great question.
So we can go on to the next slide. And so this is how we developed our very initial budget picture before getting any information from the state. So we used percentage estimates of how much we expected different categories to increase. So you can see here that for our salaries and other salary-related expenses, we were going to use 3%, and for the same percent for supplies and services. But health insurance, which, as we know, has traditionally gone up by more than other costs, we used 8%. You'll see this massive number for out-of-district tuition. Right? So the state sets the rate for out-of-district tuition rates for each school. And they are projecting that next year, those rates are going to rise by an average of 14.5%. Plus, we have experienced a significant increase in the number of students placed into out-of-district settings this year, and so projecting that might continue, and all kinds of reasons that could be behind that, but certainly recovery from the pandemic could be part of it. The charter school and school choice assessments, we're estimating 5%. Now, these are straight from the state. The state sets them. We don't have any say over them. Utilities, at this point, we're using a a high estimate for utilities because of the increase in natural gas pricing and electricity pricing. And then we're also using a big number for transportation. Now, the transportation line, well, I asked a really good question about that earlier. Mr. Collmore, you asked, this transportation line, we're expecting a sizable increase because this is the year we have to go to bid for a new contract. So as Anthony described, we asked the City Council for permission to seek a 5-year bid, which we did, and they granted because that is hopefully going to give us better pricing from vendors if they have 5 years to recoup their investment of providing our transportation. However, everyone expects rates to increase. Fuel costs, driver costs, there's a driver shortage across the nation. Bus companies are having to provide a minimum number of hours for drivers in order to attract people to the
Shortage of bus
position
drivers,
because there's a
too.
shortage.
Yeah.
So,
A lot of the school bus and routes are being affected.
yep, yeah, it is. Now, we've actually been a little more fortunate in Holyoke with our drivers staying with us than in some districts, but it still is a major challenge and one that we expect is going to increase the costs of transportation this next year. So,
I just have a quick question. In the past, excuse me, I guess we were supposed to get funding from charter schools. Is that still in play, or?
great question. Yeah, you're going to see a slide coming up that has a lot of lines on it, so it's going to be tough to read. But there is a specific line for charter school reimbursements that comes from the state. And just like this third bullet point in the non-discretionary expenses, the charter school and school choice assessments, the state sets that and what we have to pay for those costs. The state also sets what our anticipated reimbursement through that charter school law will be.
Have we been getting any reimbursements?
Yes, we have.
Okay, good.
And so last year we got about $2 million in reimbursement. So you could be to offset some of the cost of the charter schools. However, the charter schools cost was about $12 million. So it still is a significant
Cool.
cost compared to reimbursement.
It is mainly to offset new seats. So as you lose students in earlier grades, the reimbursement is higher, and the formula works in a way that they wean you off of it. So the first year you get 100%, and the next 4 years after that you get 25%. They've recently changed it. I believe a couple years ago, but like beyond the 5th year, you don't get anything for a student that's already in the charter school.
After 4 years.
After
Question, Ms. Wilson and Mr. Collmore.
So my question with health insurance, has there been any shift in our city opting to go through with GIC instead of the traditional path that it has chosen? Because I think we would see a reduction in costs, especially to our employees.
Yeah, there's been so Kelly Curran and Kevin Jourdain are running a task force to look at that,
Okay.
and I hope that at some point, hopefully like next year, but although we will know if it's next year or not, because if we want to jump into the GIC, the city would have had to let the GIC know by December 31st.
Right.
I don't know if they did that. The plan was to do that,
I know.
but I honestly
Not sure
haven't
if
been
we're-
following that task force that Kelly Curran
Okay.
and Kevin Jourdain are
I've not heard anything that would make me think that they
They have.
submitted that.
All right.
Yeah, and I've been in a few meetings with city leaders that would have, I think that would have come up if they had submitted that.
follow up. Mickey, you can follow up with Kelly. Kelly's like spearheading that process.
Oh, yeah.
Kevin Jourdain is like working with
Yep.
her.
Yeah, yeah. Mr. Collmore,
housing transportation. Is that mandatory?
What is it?
Housing, is that still mandatory?
Do you mean like the
or-
bus yard where they
Yes.
store the buses?
At one time, never had that. They had to find their own place to run their vehicles out of.
They still have to do it, but we restrict them to within the city limit, Holyoke limits. Like in our bid specifications, we specify that they have to be housed somewhere in Holyoke. Right now, it's that cut street that goes up by the old Whole Donut.
Yep.
Yeah.
That when I come down
They're,
here.
they're right
When I
there.
come down here, it's
Yes,
always there.
So
there
Yeah.
you have
that's
the little
all
cut through to come
included
to
in
Dean.
our transportation costs. We don't pay for that space. They pay for it, and they pass on the cost to us somehow through our per vehicle rates. But throughout the bid process, we say you have to be in Holyoke. You got to let us know where you're going. You can't operate out of Boston, Massachusetts, and have your
Right.
buses there. We won't. We make sure that they have a
Right.
place in
Yeah, the transportation is a really interesting thing. I mean, so the bids are being sent in, hopefully many of them, as we speak. And next Tuesday, tomorrow, we open the bids, and we're very hopeful that we have multiple bids for the very complicated transportation packages that we have. And we did a lot of things in our bid specifications to try to hold down the increase. So I'm going to be very interested to find out how those bids come in next week. Like, for example, the one big item is that in the past, the bus company has paid for the fuel and then passed that cost on to us. This year, we're bidding it so that we pay for the fuel. We don't pay state or federal taxes on the diesel. Pretty significant. The taxes for those are pretty significant. So we're hoping that can hold down the increases. We still expect pretty sizable increases based on other districts' experience over the last year.
And I want to re-emphasize that because I know it's going to be a hot topic this year around budget. 2 years ago, I went to the city and I said, please, we're due for a bid. If we go out to bid right now, we're going to see a 27% increase based on what I'm hearing around the state. We can extend our contract and see 2% increases for the next couple of years. Let's do this. Costs are going to go up. These transportation companies just lost a lot of money during the pandemic because we're mostly remote. So they weren't, they still had to pay their drivers. They still had to pay the leases. They still had to pay their rent, pay the leases on their fleet. They lost a lot of money. So it was a horrible time to go out to bid. And I had a feeling that we would have seen significant increases. Those 2 years are up, and they still lost money. So we expect to see some increases, especially now that fuel's higher. And we just went through this rezoning process. So as part of that process, there's going to be changes to, how many buses we have on the road. So we do anticipate increases in transportation, and we've had 2 years to prep for this, right? And when I say we, I mean, I warned the city this was happening 2 years ago. So I hope that there's no surprises, but I anticipate there will be a lot of discussion around this budget item.
Well, we can go to the next slide, and this is where you'll see the full, what we call the budget blueprint. So the segments of the expenses that we were looking at earlier, starting right down where those red lines are towards the bottom, that's how we build the budget with those non-discretionary expenses there. And so here you can see on the expenses section down below those percentage increases that we were looking at on the previous slide. And then we look at the revenue up top, you'll see on the very first two lines, we use that 5% projection of what we're hoping Student Opportunity Act will provide. Now, it's possible that the Student Opportunity Act's rate changes will result in more than 5%. Could be less, but we're kind of got our fingers crossed about 5% or more. And so every change in that, how that gets implemented, that's the key driver for our overall budget. So using these assumptions, that 5% increase in revenue, those assumptions about the increase in costs for the different categories, you can see in the very bottom row, in yellow, that this budget would have a small surplus if this is how everything turned out. If this is how much revenue we ended up getting, and if the costs increased by these percentages, we would be able to meet what we call a level services budget and have a small surplus. So there's a lot going on this slide. What questions do you have about it here at first view?
So my thought would be based upon, the inability to find some special education providers, that we would see an increase in expenses in that area in order to ensure that our students are getting the speech and language they need. I would assume that school psychology, the testing, that's not going to decrease, as we all know, due to COVID and the gap in learning, and people are asking for that, even though the nation is seeing disparity in learning for all students. So my question is, are we going to be increasing those costs we anticipate for those, the contracted employees?
Yeah, we're gonna monitor that stuff through the budget development process. Right now, we're covering some of those increases on ESSER because we have it. Our hopes is that eventually it gets better, but we have to meet the needs of our students in our community. So we're gonna work with Marianne Courier, who manages the budget, analyze like what happened this year and how much were like the increases for speech, how much were the increases for psychology. Because we are working with vendors. We haven't been able to fill our SLPA positions and our
Correct.
SLPs,
Yep.
but we have a company out of Boston that's been finding people and placing them here. We're paying more to that company than what we
absolutely.
would for but like, so our costs are 100% going up this year, but we're going to work with Marianne to figure out what it is that she needs in next year's budget. But our hopes is that we hope that it gets better. It's not necessarily a sustainable model
No.
at all. And we saw on a previous slide we're getting additional funding, but if we're using that additional funding to pay more for the same service, it's not really being effective. It's not
Right.
being put to use like it should be, which is to really, really support our students and staff.
Question, Mr. Palmore. Yeah.
Is there any chance bringing some out of place children back?
Very good question. So yes, and it happens naturally sometimes that a student gets to the point where they are the best setting for them is back in one of our Holyoke schools, and we've had a couple different rounds of trying to really identify which students go out. So over the last several months, we've actually developed a process for more closely tracking students, out-of-district student costs, and at the individual student level. And it's a collaboration between our enrollment team, our data team, our finance team, and our special ed team. And matter of fact, we just met last week on Thursday and reviewed, and we're going to do it each month to review new students going, changes in students who might be coming back. And we're going to use it in some ways to increase the awareness across the district around the change in our out of district placement. So it's really been a fairly significant increase this year in number of students going out, and every student, it's a very large cost, $75,000 or so per student, not counting the transportation costs, which in addition to that. So
Is that
it is
something-
possible, and we're trying to organize some efforts to track it as closely as possible.
Are other districts as well seeing that same increase as I would anticipate based upon that social emotional deficit and the significant challenges? students-
Absolutely.
I
Yeah,
would
Mary
assume
Ann.
that this is across the board in the United States that
Yeah.
everyone's seeing an increase in that specialized program for those students.
Yeah, I would say that. So, like, we have about 120 students. Mickey, I don't.
About 110.
110.
Yeah,
Give or
110.
Good.
It's been 110 for the last, 5-6 years. So I don't see a drastic increase in students going out. It's right around the same amount, but there's definitely a lot of the issues that we were talking about earlier. Every district in the Commonwealth is grappling with the speech pathology, and the psychologist, like all the Mary Ann meets with a group of SPED directors, and they all talk about it every month. I would say that Holyoke's need is certainly greater than other communities. We have some students in Willie Ross, like
Right.
for the deaf, but there's also some definitely some SEL and therapeutic intervention programs that probably isn't as like in terms of enrollment as large in other communities.
Question.
Got about.
Yep.
Want to maybe wrap up some of the
Yeah. Perfect.
highlights of it?
Yeah, let's go.
Um,
Let's go. I think this is one of the big things to keep in mind. If we go to the next slide. So this image shows that we at Holyoke are hugely dependent on the state. So when the state generates that number for what our minimum spending is, almost 89% of that is going to come from state aid, and about 11% come from city funding, right? So that's a really big deal, and why the state budget process, we live and die by the state budget process. And so you can go to the next slide, and you can see here's like the steps in the state budget timeline, and so we're following each one of these steps because every time something changes in their calculations, it has a major direct impact on our budget, right? And you'll see in there that we have a different process this year. Normally, the governor's budget is what kicks off the budget year for the state, and that happens at the end of January, and that tells us here's your number. And that's not going to happen this year, so when there's a new governor, that gets delayed.
Yep.
So we're using some estimates, a system for estimating and getting a more specific number for our revenue that we'll build our budget on. And you can go to the next slide, and you can see here's what our process is going to be internally as we develop our budget. So, like I said, we're going to be following that process, but we're going to be rolling out.
Bring up the whole slide, Sam.
Oh, sorry. Yep. Okay. We're going to be rolling out the budgets for individual chiefs and departments. We do that first. We're going to be getting those budgets in February. By the end of February, early March, we'll have those set. Then school budgets will roll out in early February, and February through April, those budgets will be set. And then by May 1st, we'll have a balanced budget for the entire district.
And I just want to, part of this presentation and for new members, I want you to understand the budget development process.
Remember
We
last
don't,
year?
it's not us sitting behind closed doors making decisions. We actually have a very, very inclusive process where we have our target class sizes that we try to meet. We allocate positions to that, but a significant portion of the budget principals actually are given a funding allocation, and they design their budget. I think they did a really good job trying to design a budget that puts students' needs first, as they do every year. But it's not like Mickey and I are sitting making decisions for principals. They're actually a huge part of the process,
I
and
remember
they
this
go
from
through a
last year.
budget hearing, where they present their ideas. They present based on the funding that they have. They present how they're going to use that funding, and it doesn't always mean that when they walk in, they leave with the same budget, because we
Challenge them, as you should.
yeah, we ask clarifying questions. Why are you prioritizing this over this? And ultimately, we put a budget forward that we strongly believe puts students first.
So we go to the final slide. And so these are some kind of high-level final thoughts. The revenue through the Student Opportunity Act changes the picture fundamentally for us. The ESSER funds have allowed us to invest in some of those things that we want to do through Student Opportunity Act, because that's going to increase year by year, and we've sort of accelerated our investment in some staffing positions using ESSER to get there. So ESSER has really been helping to drive our strategic priorities. And then the rezoning will create instructional efficiencies, which was the driving force behind the rezoning. It will also create budget efficiencies, and so there's no question that will give us more flexibility to meet our priorities.
Yeah, an easy example is we're closing PEC. PEC costs $600,000 just to run electrical on an annual basis. So we can't completely shut down PEC in case we have to put students back in there in the future if we don't get this new building. So we'll be running,
Right, the minimum.
making sure the pipes don't freeze and all that stuff. So we're not going to reduce that to zero, but we expect to see some significant efficiencies there. Snow removal, like, we hire people to come in and clear our parking lots and stuff like that. We're not going to be doing that for PEC as much. We'll probably have some staff in the main office there, but that we'll have to clear, but not the entire parking lot. So we'll see. Things like that are easy to see, how we're realizing some efficiencies as part of rezoning.
Question, Mr. Collmore.
So, along those lines. So we have no intention right now of turning that over to the city.
PEC will not have students next year, and we're hopeful that we get the city council to approve a new middle school, and we could begin demolition. But until the city council votes on that, I want to make sure that we have a backup plan. And if that falls through, we'll be able to move kids out of Metcalf and move kids out of Dean and put them into PEC.
We're just talking special ed right now. We have enough space for special ed in our
Do we have enough space? Right now we have an abundance of space. Next year we will not have an abundance of space. Next year it will be more crowded in our schools for sure. Especially, when we presented our rezoning guidance, that was one of the things we did. We did a capacity analysis, and none of our schools are at 100% capacity. Many of them were only at 50% capacity. Lawrence, for example, only has 150 students and can fit 500 students. So, but Lawrence has probably taken some classroom spaces and made them into offices. Next year, we're using all of the classrooms for classroom space. So we've done walkthroughs at every single one of our buildings to try to make sure that we have the spaces that we need. But I'm going on record letting everybody know, like, it will be a little tighter than what people are used to, but there's going to be space.
when we build a new pack,
Yep.
we're going to get it done.
Yep.
Are there any plans to put any additional special ed at school?
Yeah, that was all part of our instructional plan and our ed plan. That was part of the MSBA process. They're aware of all the spaces required that we're looking for based on our student population.
What I'm getting at is back quite a few years because of school enrollment. We had to close down Ian White. We turned that building over into special ed. And a lot of the students came back from out of placement back to Ian White School. Plus, because of transportation, other cities and towns, it was cheaper for them to just bring them into Ohio, have their special ed here in Ohio. There's some way should be thinking about that?
Yeah, we would never make one school all special education. That would completely go against one of our core strategic priorities of including our special population students in a general, with their peers. So we would never do something like that. But I will say that as part of rezoning, we have expanded special ed programming to more locations. So, for example, the ABL program right now only exists from K to 5 at Donahue School. We are going to be splitting that so that it exists at Donahue School and at Morgan School. So, we are trying our best to create those opportunities for students to attend the school in their neighborhood, but it's not a perfect science.
So, a month.
I would like every month. I think we're in the swing of things.
Your call.
I think I'd like an update every month.
Yeah, I gotta say that bringing an update on the current year spending is very easy to do every month, and then an update on where we're at in that development process, because the next 6 months are going to be filled with that development process. So it would be very easy to do, and I really enjoy getting to talk with you. I mean, the public policy aspect of what we do is super interesting. So I love coming here, and I love coming to City Council too.
Plus, I would like to get a better understanding of, if, when we get back local control, I wish, what are the type of things that on a monthly basis, there's I want to say warrants, is that true? Is that a proper term? Thank you. The warrants that need to be signed, like if we could get a general idea of those expenses that are going out every month that we as a school committee would typically be looking at. That is what I would like to get into.
I would recommend that, like, for the rest of this spring, focusing on, okay, here's our current snapshots of spending. You're going to see some interesting trends in that, and that we'll be able to discuss. And then where are we at in our development of the 24 budget? I think that the questions that you're talking about with the local control, the shift back to local control, is a process change that we can talk about that. Okay, well, what would be different if the school committee were
Right. Like, what are the things that would typically, what expenses would typically be coming to us while we don't have, the power, that sign-off power right now, but in the future we would be getting that. So let's just say 2 years, it's not like something brand new to us on this committee, that we've seen these costs come in, we've seen these expenses. So when the warrants do start coming across to us, that we have that knowledge and we've developed that knowledge base, and as well to demonstrate to the state that we have the ability to do
we certainly
that.
Dig into that aim point. I think that the next 5 months are going to be so full of numbers for this year and next year that it might be good to focus on those, because it would give the committee a real chance to understand the structure of the budget, where the money goes, what the key factors are in a really in-depth way. And then if we get past that budget development process, so after May, so starting in June, digging some into that process, that might be a good timeline in my
Okay.
So I'll take, thank Soto.
I'll make a motion to adjourn, and then I second it or whatever.
Second.
And so, all right,
Thank you
Meeting
much.
adjourned. I appreciate it.
at 5:59.
On that time.